Hey everyone, and welcome. So if you've ever worked on a big front-end app, you know the feeling, right? The code base just keeps growing, the builds get slower and slower, and honestly, every single deployment feels like this huge, high-stakes gamble. Well, today we are tackling that exact problem. We're going to go from monolith to micro, and we'll explore exactly how to build a micro front-end architecture, focusing specifically on how to do it with React. Okay, let's get into it.
So here's our game plan for today. First, we're going to really dig in and diagnose the problem. What's so wrong with monolithic front-ends anyway? Then, we'll introduce micro front-ends as the potential cure and explore the amazing autonomy they can unlock for your teams. After that, we'll get our hands dirty with a step-by-step guide to actually building one in React. And finally, we'll wrap up by helping you figure out if this architecture is actually the right move for you and your project.
All right, let's start by meeting the villain of our story today, the monolithic front-end. You know, it always starts out so simple, so innocent. But as you add more features and more teams, it can grow into this massive bottleneck that just gets in everyone's way.
I want you to just pause for a second and think about your current projects. Does it ever feel like your user interface code is actively fighting against you? Like it's holding your team back from moving quickly? If you're nodding along right now, trust me, you are not alone.
These right here are the classic symptoms. You've got this one single gigantic React application. A tiny change over here somehow breaks a totally unrelated feature over there. Your builds take forever to finish. Every deployment is a stressful all-or-nothing event. And trying to scale by adding more teams, it just becomes a nightmare of merge conflicts and tangled up code. It's really just a recipe for slowing down innovation to a crawl.
But what if there was a better way? Let's flip the script and introduce the hero of our story, the micro front-end architecture.
You know, the core idea here is actually pretty simple, but it is incredibly powerful. We're basically taking a page from the back-end microservices playbook and applying that same thinking to the front end. So instead of one giant app, we build a collection of smaller, totally independent applications that all come together to create one single, cohesive user experience.
Now, the key word here, the part that makes all the difference, is ownership. See, each micro front-end isn't just a piece of code, it's a whole product, and it's owned end-to-end by a single, dedicated team. This changes everything. It creates accountability, it builds expertise, and it completely transforms how teams can build and maintain their slice of the UI.
This is probably the best way to think about it. If you already get the concept of breaking down a big back-end system into smaller microservices, then you're already halfway there. We're just applying that same powerful idea of decoupling and independence to the user interface.
So you might be asking, why go through all this trouble just to break things up? Well, it all boils down to one incredibly important word: autonomy. Giving your teams the autonomy to work independently isn't just a nice to have, it's a superpower for scaling your development efforts.
And just look at these benefits. Each one of these is a direct answer to the pains of the monolith we just talked about. Teams can develop features without stepping on each other's toes. They can deploy their own updates on their own schedule. One team could even decide to use a newer version of React, or maybe even a different framework, without affecting anyone else. Oh, and if one part of the app goes down, it won't crash the entire website. That's huge!
Let's think about what this actually feels like for a development team on a day-to-day basis. Instead of one huge team trying to navigate one giant, complex repository, you now have smaller, more focused teams, each working in their own little sandbox. Builds are way faster, dependencies are much clearer, and that loose coupling means teams can move fast and innovate without constantly worrying about breaking someone else's code.
The deployment story is just as amazing. You can say goodbye to those big, risky release trains where every single feature has to ship at the same time. With micro front-ends, the payments team can deploy 3 times a day if they want, while the search team deploys once a week. And if something goes wrong with a new payment feature, you just roll back that one micro front-end, not the entire application. The risk is so much lower.
All right, that's enough theory. Let's get our hands dirty. How do we actually build this stuff with React? Well, the most popular and, frankly, most powerful tool for the job right now is something called Webpack's Module Federation. So here's our roadmap. It's pretty straightforward. We'll start by creating a shell application, which is kind of like a container. Then we'll build our first remote micro front-end. After that, we'll configure both of them so they can talk to each other using Module Federation. And finally, we'll dynamically load that remote component right into our shell. It's actually not as complicated as it sounds.
Okay, first things first, we create the shell. You can think of this as the main frame of our application. It's responsible for the things that are shared across the whole site, like the header, the navigation, the footer, and it's also the component in charge of figuring out which micro front end to load and where to put it on the page. We can just kick it off with a standard Create React app.
Next up, we create our first feature-specific app. For our example, let's say it handles payments, so we'll call it Payments. Now, this is a completely separate standalone React application. A dedicated payments team would own this. It knows everything there is to know about payments and absolutely nothing else.
Okay, here's our first little technical hurdle. By default, Create React App hides all the complicated Webpack configuration from us, which is usually a good thing. But to use Module Federation, we need to get in there and tweak it. That's where a tool like Krakow comes in. It lets us override the default Webpack settings without having to eject and take on the burden of managing that entire complex config ourselves. It's a lifesaver.
Now for the configuration. In our Payments app, we're going to create a krakow.config.js file. The most important line here is the expose is property. We're essentially telling Module Federation, hey, I have a component over here at ./src/app, and I want to share it with the world. Please make it available under the name ./payments_app. This is like creating a public API for our UI component. Under the hood, this generates a special file called remoteentry.js, which is basically a map of all the components this app is sharing.
Now, over in our shell app, we do the opposite. We add a remotes property to its configuration. This tells the shell, hey, if you ever see some code trying to import something from payments, don't look for it locally. Instead, go fetch the map from this URL at runtime. And that right there is the magic of Module Federation. The connection between these two apps isn't figured out when you build the code. It's resolved dynamically right in the user's browser.
And this is where it all comes together beautifully. Inside our shell apps code, we can now use react.lazy to do a dynamic import. Notice we're importing Payments app from Payments. That's the name we just defined in our Webpack config. Module Federation intercepts this request, goes and fetches the component from the URL we provided, and React Suspense component gives us a really clean way to show a loading state while we wait for that micro frontend to arrive. It just works.
Okay, so we've seen the why and we've seen the how. But this all leads to probably the most important question of all. Should you actually be using this? Because look, this architecture is incredibly powerful, but it's definitely not a silver bullet for every problem. Here's a pretty simple guide to help you decide. If you're building a massive, enterprise-scale application, and you have multiple teams who all need to ship features on their own timelines, then yes, microfrontends are an absolute game changer. But if you're a small team, or you're working on a single product, or you're just trying to get an MVP out the door as fast as possible, the extra complexity is probably just going to slow you down. In that case, stick with a simple monolith until you actually start to feel the pain.
So let's do a quick recap. The main thing to remember is that micro frontends are basically microservices for your UI. Their whole purpose is to improve scalability, give teams more autonomy, and make deployments faster and safer. For all you React developers, Webpack's Module Federation is the go-to tool for making this happen. And most importantly, remember this is a tool for managing complexity at a large scale, not something you should reach for on every new project. So, I'll just leave you with this one final thought to chew on. Take a look at your own work, your own team. Is your current architecture a bottleneck? Could breaking up that monolith into a federation of micro frontends unlock a whole new level of speed and potential for your team? It's a powerful idea and definitely one worth exploring. Thanks for joining me.